18 years ago, on this day, a miracle happened. And I'd like to tell you a story about that. It's called When Dreams Come True at 60. And for those of you watching, you may know the background. And it's a pretty cool story. And it goes like this. It was a rainy day on January 1st, 2001. Bustling about the kitchen, Barbara nervously glanced at the clock on the kitchen stove. Only 30 more minutes and the guests would be arriving. At age 59, Barbara had planned a beginning of the true millennium singles party. As a group of single women, she and her 4 roommates decided to invite everyone they knew, no matter what age or gender, to celebrate life and new beginnings. With an oven mitt on either hand, she hustled to the door to greet a few early arrivals. In that moment, she had no idea her life was about to change forever. For 8 years, she had been divorced, having ended a 3rd marriage after only a short time. Each time, Barbara had begun the relationship with high hopes that it would last forever. After several failed attempts, she wondered if she would ever find the one, the true one, with whom to share the rest of her life. Standing in the doorway of her Central Virginia home was a tall, handsome man with a commanding yet gentle presence. He had arrived with his mother Lillian and his sister Barbara, both of whom were in her church choir. Barbara had known them for years, but had only met Alan a few times. He worked as a prison guard in upstate New York. The first time she had met him was after a church service several years before, although Barbara had been so distracted about an open house she needed to attend that day that she barely paid attention to what he was saying. As a local real estate agent, she was aware that he had bought a house in a neighboring town. At another holiday party his mother had hosted the week before, he had told her he planned to retire there in another 3 years. "Are you single and will you come to my party?" Barbara blurted out without thinking how she might sound. Offering a shy smile, he politely accepted the invitation. Yes, and I'm single," he murmured. "In fact, I've never been married." In that moment, she wondered why she had never really noticed him before. It seemed that each time they managed to connect over the past few years, it had always been a brief interchange. Barbara was constantly rushing about, going from one appointment to another. With a busy real estate office and children now in college, she had spent the last 20 years in a drastic hurry. Greeting Alan in the doorway now was no different. After taking their coats, she quickly excused herself to do the finishing touches for the party. "Can I do anything to help?" Dressed in a nice sweater and slacks, Alan looked about the kitchen for something to do. "Help?" Barbara faltered for a moment. Dangling the oven mitts at her sides, she looked at him for a brief pause. Standing in her kitchen, she thought back to the week before when he had handed her a steaming cup of hot cider. "Be careful," he had said. "It's rather hot." He had approached her with his hand on the cup, the handle pointed toward her. She had noticed it was indeed very hot, and what a gentleman he was to hand it to her that way. "Help?" Barbara half whispered, glancing about the mess she had made on the kitchen counters. What a nice concept! She wasn't anywhere near ready. "You could lay the fire," she suggested as she hurried back to the stove. "Sometimes what you want is right before your very eyes." There were plenty of times over the last decade that Barbara would sit in church with hands folded, gaze heavenward and say, "Please tell me if I dare trust my heart to a man again, Lord. Is there a loving, thoughtful, honest man out there who would love me as I love him? Someone who shares my values, someone who would go to church with me until the day I die?" One day she heard an answer that astounded her. It came swift and sure. "Yes, and you will meet him in this church. When you are 60, you will marry him. And I have saved the best for last." This church, where she had buried her second husband, where her granddaughter had been baptized, where she spent hours upon hours praying for Mr. Wright? It seemed hardly possible. Staring out the rain-soaked kitchen window now, she felt a presence behind her. "Do you have a bucket?" she heard Alan ask. She whirled around to see him with a purposeful look in his eye. A bucket? Barbara rummaged under the laundry sink and came up with what he required. He disappeared around the corner again. Guests began arriving, and Barbara busied herself with greeting them at the door. After a while, Alan came back to the kitchen for a third time. "Do you have a garden?" he asked. Now, what in the world, she thought. Then she realized he had been down on his knees in his party clothes, cleaning out her fireplace that contained 4 years of ashes, and built a roaring fire, a real rip snorter, her dad would have said. A strange feeling came over her. Her best friend, Kate, and Barbara would often take God trips, the kind of journeys in which God only knows where they'll show up or where they'll end up. They trust that their journey will land them exactly where they need to be. On Barbara's 59th birthday, on April 26, 2000, Kate had taken her to a lovely B&B on the beach. They wrote the initials of all their boyfriends, starting with first grade and ending with the initials of their Mr. Wright. Not knowing who that might be, Barbara towed the letters A.D. into the sand. Shortly thereafter, the waves washed away the women's efforts. Kate had Barbara write down all the qualities she wanted in a man. The words came effortlessly. He listens to me and understands. I do the same for him. He appreciates beauty, truth, humor, different cultures, my children, and me. He loves to play, is generous with his time, his treasure, his thoughts, and feelings. He never thinks I ask too much. He inspires, delights, loves, laughs, plants, builds, is up to making a difference in the world. We build something bigger than the sum of two parts. We enjoy the ocean, Alaska, Ireland, London, Paris, Latvia. We spread joy. He is open to new things, experiences, is sensual, warm, competent, loyal, and fun. And so am I. Watching the fire cast a long glow over Alan's face now, Barbara realized his initials were A.D., Alan Drinkwater. While she remained busy entertaining her guests, she was acutely aware of the man in the ash-covered sweater sitting quietly in front of the fire the whole evening. Because his mother and sister wished to leave early, Barbara and Alan quickly hugged each other goodbye. "Thank you for building such a beautiful fire, and please come back." Barbara beamed at him. He didn't return, and she tried to hide her disappointment for the remainder of the party. The next morning, she was back in her real estate office when her secretary boomed down the hall, "Do you know a Native American?" What could she be talking about? "There's a man on the phone who says he's Mr. Firewater." Now she was really puzzled. When she picked up the phone, Barbara heard laughter. "What I really said was, tell her it's Mr. Drinkwater, the firemaker. Do you like movies?" Mr. Firemaker invited Barbara on her first date of the new year. After the movie, he asked her what she might be doing in a few weeks when he had some time off. Pretty soon, they were seeing each other regularly. On her 60th birthday that spring, Alan took Barbara on a romantic drive through the Shenandoah Valley. She noticed he was a bit nervous. They had known each other for over 4 months and had spent a great deal of time together despite the distance between Virginia and New York. In fact, he had set a new driving record each time he came to visit. Saying nothing, he pulled over to a vista overlooking the valley on Skyline Drive. Reaching into his pocket, Alan handed Barbara the most beautiful diamond ring with rows of tiny gems flanking both sides. It was in that moment that she remembered the prophecy she had heard in the church 6 years prior. When you're 60, you will marry him. That fall, they got married at the same church that had been the showplace of so much joy and sorrow in her life. Under a shower of fireworks and northern lights, the couple celebrated on their horse farm in central Virginia. Dancing to Barbara Streisand's beautiful song, I Dreamed of You, Barbara Drinkwater realized now that she was no longer dreaming. It had taken 60 years, but she had found the one. It had required patience and a lot of faith. And yes, he has all the qualities she asked for.